The golden mask of Ramses II hides a face that once contorted in absolute paralyzing terror amidst the swirling dust of Kadesh. We are told he stood alone against 2,000 chariots and emerged a god, but the silent strata of the earth suggest a reality far more fragile than the granite statues he left behind. History is often written by the survivor, and Ramses was the ultimate survivor. A man who realized early on that if you repeat a lie loudly enough and carve it deep enough into the mountainside, the truth becomes an irrelevant ghost. This is not just the chronicle of a pharaoh. It is the study of a man who manufactured eternity to mask a moment of total vulnerability. The shadow he cast over Egypt was not merely one of protection, but of an all-consuming ambition that demanded the very breath of his people. To look upon the monuments of the 19th dynasty is to witness a frantic race against mortality. He didn't just build temples, he attempted to forge a version of himself that could never be touched by failure or decay. But beneath the colossal feat of his likenesses at Abu Simbel, there is a lingering question that the official records refuse to answer. What happens to a nation when its leader decides he is no longer a man, but the sun itself? The answer lies in the gap between the gold and the granite. The conflict began not with a grand vision, but with the cold, hard necessity of resources and the encroaching steel of the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were the invisible nightmare of the north, a power that did not fear the divine lineage of the Nile. When Ramses marched his 4 divisions, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, toward the city of Kadesh, he wasn't just marching toward a battle, he was marching into a meticulously laid trap. The intelligence he received was flawed, perhaps intentionally so, leading him to believe the enemy was leagues away when they were actually crouched just over the horizon, waiting for the Egyptian line to stretch thin. As the division of Amun pitched their tents, the horizon didn't shimmer with heat, but with the bronze of 2,500 Hittite chariots. The ambush was surgical. The division of Ra, caught in the open and unprepared, was shredded before they could even form a defensive line. Survivors fled toward the camp, bringing chaos and the metallic scent of a lost cause. This was the moment the myth was born. The official Egyptian accounts describe Ramses as a solitary whirlwind of divine fury, charging into the fray when his generals had fled and his soldiers were broken. They say he called upon his father, Amun, and the god answered with the strength of 100,000 men, allowing the pharaoh to push back the entire Hittite army single-handedly. But a darker, more complex narrative exists between the lines of the celebratory poems. Archaeological evidence and Hittite records hint at a desperate stalemate rather than a total triumph. The king's victory might have been a frantic tactical retreat, saved only by the sudden arrival of elite reserve units from the coast. Yet when Ramses returned to the delta, the story changed. The narrow escape was rebranded as a celestial intervention. He ordered the walls of every major temple to be plastered with scenes of his solitary heroism, turning a near disaster into a foundational myth of his divinity. He replaced the reality of a chaotic, indecisive draw with a cinematic masterpiece of propaganda that would endure for 3 millennia. This obsession with image was not a byproduct of his reign, it was the engine that drove it. To sustain the illusion of a living god, Ramses transformed Egypt into a perpetual construction site. The city of Pi-Ramesses rose from the marshes of the delta, a glittering metropolis of turquoise tiles and gilded gates, built at a pace that suggests a staggering human cost. It was a city designed to overawe, a physical manifestation of a power that brooked no dissent. Here, the king was not just the head of state, but the center of the universe, surrounded by a court that functioned more like a cult of personality than a government. The labor required for these feats was monumental. While historians debate the exact nature of the workforce, The sheer scale of the limestone and granite moved across the desert speaks of a society pushed to its absolute limit. The quarries of Aswan and the hills of the Theban necropolis echoed with the sound of bronze on stone day and night for decades. There is a specific kind of silence found in the ruins of the workers' huts, a silence that hints at lives consumed by the pharaoh's hunger for scale. He wasn't just building for the gods, he was building a cage for time itself, hoping that by making his image large enough, death would simply overlook him. Every stone laid was a brick in a fortress against his own humanity. As the decades passed, the man behind the mask began to disappear. Ramses reigned for 66 years, an incredible span in an era where life was often short and brutal. He outlived his contemporaries, his enemies, and even many of his own children. Each passing year only reinforced his claim to divinity in the eyes of his subjects. If he wasn't a god, how could he remain seated on the throne while the world around him withered and changed? He took the titles of Uzer Matra Setapenre, the justice of Ra is powerful, chosen of Ra, and eventually he crossed a line that few of his predecessors dared. He began to worship himself. In the inner sanctums of his temples, the wall carvings depict Ramses the king, making offerings to Ramses the god. It is a chilling loop of self-adulation. This wasn't just political theater, it was a psychological fortification. By deifying his own living form, he made any criticism of his policies an act of sacrilege. The heavy taxes, the endless conscriptions for his building projects, and the potential famines were all shielded by the blinding light of his supposed divinity. The administration became a machine dedicated entirely to the preservation of his legend, regardless of the mounting pressure on the kingdom's foundation. Yet even a god cannot stop the clock. The later years of his reign were marked by a slow, creeping decay that no amount of incense or prayer could stave off. The vibrant pharaoh who had once charged the Hittite lines was now an elderly man suffering from severe arthritis and dental abscesses that must have caused agonizing, constant pain. The irony is profound. The man who commanded the sun to rise and the Nile to flood was held hostage by the frailties of a human body. The physical reality of his mummy reveals a man who was tall and commanding, yes, but also one who was ultimately broken by the very time he tried to conquer. Even his diplomacy was a masterclass in calculated ambiguity. The peace treaty with the Hittites, the first recorded in history, is often hailed as a landmark of international relations. But if you look closer, the conflict of narratives remains. Each side's version of the treaty claims the upper hand. To his people, Ramses presented the treaty not as a compromise between equals, but as a formal submission by a defeated foe. He married Hittite princesses, incorporating them into his vast harem, not as a gesture of union, but as a collection of trophies. The peace was real, and it brought stability, but the narrative was manufactured to ensure the pharaoh never appeared to have blinked first. The legacy he left behind is one of staggering magnitude and deep, unsettling questions. He left more statues, more inscriptions, and more monuments than any other pharaoh in history. But he also engaged in a systematic campaign of cultural absorption. He effectively erased the names of his predecessors from their own monuments, carving his cartouche over theirs, literally overwriting history to ensure that only his name would echo through the corridors of time. When we think of ancient Egypt today, we are often seeing it through the lens Ramses ground for us. He wanted to be the beginning and the end of the Egyptian story. But what did this obsession cost the soul of the nation? The brilliance of his reign often masks the internal pressures that began to fracture the kingdom shortly after his death. The resources were depleted, the borders were stretched thin, and the central authority was so tied to his specific personhood that his successors struggled to maintain the illusion. The greatness of Ramses was a heavy mantle, one that perhaps crushed the very civilization it sought to immortalize. He built for eternity, but in doing so, he may have exhausted the present until there was nothing left for the future. As we walk through the Ramesseum today, seeing the shattered colossus that inspired poets to write about the vanity of kings, we are forced to confront the duality of power. Is a leader great because of what they build, or because of what they preserve? Ramses II chose to build. He chose the mountain, the stone, and the elaborate lie. He created a version of himself that could never die, but in doing so, he left us a riddle wrapped in gold and granite. He sacrificed the truth of the man for the immortality of the image. The mystery of Ramses isn't found in the dates of his battles or the names of his queens. It's found in the eyes of his statues, eyes that look out over a desert that has reclaimed almost everything he built. There is a sense that he knew the sands would eventually win, and his entire life was a defiant, magnificent, and perhaps terrifying scream against the coming dark. We are left to wonder if he was the protector of his people or the architect of a beautiful gilded exhaustion. He was a man who became a god by erasing the possibility of being anything else. In the end, the dark thriller of his life is the story of a man who succeeded in his ultimate goal. He became the face of a civilization, but that face is a mask, and the true Ramses, the one who felt the heat of the sun, the sting of the sand, and the cold grip of fear at Kadesh, remains hidden. He is a ghost trapped in the very stone he commanded to speak for him. The monument stands silent, offering no apologies for the cost of their creation, leaving us to decide if the glory was worth the shadow it cast across the centuries. Every time we look at his preserved remains, we see the ultimate contradiction. The most powerful man on earth, reduced to a fragile, leathery form, once held the world in a grip of iron. He convinced millions he was a god, and perhaps, for a time, he even convinced himself. But the desert winds don't care for titles, and the Nile continues to flow regardless of whose name is carved on its banks. The glory of Ramses the Great remains a magnificent facade, a testament to the power of the human will to create its own truth, no matter how many lives it takes to fuel the fire. The true weight of his reign is felt in the silence of the tombs he commissioned. Each one was a desperate attempt to secure a place in the afterlife that matched his ego in this one. He surrounded himself with the imagery of his own triumph, even as the world beyond the palace walls began to show signs of strain. The gold was meant to reflect the light of the sun, but it also blinded those who sought to see the reality of his empire. He was a master of the stage, and Egypt was his theater. The legacy of Kadesh remained his most potent weapon. Even as he grew old and his body failed him, the stories of his solitary charge against the Hittite chariots were recited in every village and marketplace. It was the glue that held the social fabric together, the belief that their king was a supernatural force. If that belief were to waver, the entire structure of the 19th dynasty would collapse. This forced the administration into a cycle of ever-increasing grandiosity. To stop building was to admit mortality. To stop the propaganda was to admit the stalemate. When we consider the sheer number of statues that bear his likeness, we see a man who was terrified of being forgotten. He didn't just want to be remembered. He wanted to be the only thing remembered. By carving his name over the works of his ancestors, he attempted to claim their achievements as his own, creating a temporal monopoly on Egyptian history. This was not just vanity, it was a calculated attempt to become the singular, eternal identity of the nation. The cost of this immortality was paid in the sweat and lives of generations. The massive stones of Abu Simbel did not move themselves, and the glittering halls of Pir Ramesses were not raised by divine intervention. They were the result of a society geared toward a single purpose, the exaltation of one man. As the sun sets over the Nile, casting long shadows from his remaining colossi, the brilliance of his monuments seems to dim. We are left with the image of a man who achieved everything he wanted, only to find that even a mountain of stone cannot provide the one thing he truly craved, a victory over the truth of his own end. The final chapter of his story is not written in the temples, but in the slow decline of the empire that followed him. Within a century of his death, the borders he fought to expand were shrinking, and the central authority he had personified was crumbling. The greatness of Ramses had been a flame that burned too bright, consuming the very fuel it needed to survive. He left behind a desert filled with his name, but a people who had forgotten how to stand without the shadow of a god to guide them. We look back at him now and see a masterpiece of human will. Ramses II was a visionary, a warrior, and a diplomat, but he was also the architect of a magnificent deception. He showed the world that if you control the narrative, you control the gods themselves. But as the wind whistles through the ruins of the Ramesseum, it carries a reminder that no mask, no matter how golden, can hide the face of a man who once knew terror in the dust of a forgotten battle. The king is dead, the god is stone, and the truth remains buried in the sand, waiting for the wind to shift once more.